Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Professor Barry here. And yeah, this week we are moving into really just positivist theories of deviance and criminality. Um, yeah, so Stuart Henry, the author of our textbook, kind of like weaving this story about deviance and the sociological perspective on deviance and crime, kind of like bringing forward ideas about things like the moral entrepreneur, moral panics, bringing up different theories in different chapters, sometimes bringing up a theory in one chapter, bringing it up again in another chapter and another chapter for different reasons. Um, so I think it's really important. He brings up a lot of different positivist theories, and they're in different chapters. So this lecture here is identifying all the positivist theories. And recall back with positivism is the approach to science where you're seeking ways of measuring variables, identifying variables, things that are influencing behavior or outcomes, things that are observable. A positivist view, it asserts the idea that there's something different between those who commit acts of deviance and those in crime versus those who do not. Individuals who engage in who are more prone to an addiction, to substance. There's things in their past and their history that's patterned that increases the likelihood these individuals may experience addiction sometimes in their lifetime versus individuals who do not. So, yeah, there's very positivist theories. So, with that being said, we're going to move in this week. It's all about identifying, talking through all of these different theories. And I think, between the lecture and the book, I think you get a good grounding on these different kind of theories, which are seeking to understand the causes and motivations for deviance and crime. So there's a lot of different theories. Always important to keep in mind that there's no one right theory, no one best theory. There are different theories that explain different types or different forms of deviance and crime, or different theories that some theories are more applicable in certain situations versus others. Certain theories address certain types of crime or deviance better than others. So it's not like there's one theory. There's a lot of different theories, and it's the ability to think through the logic of the theory and understand what is the framework of the theory. That's like an important part. So the applicability of the theory depends on what we're looking at. And I think we need to have multiple theories to be able to give us a better understanding of the social world. The more theories we have, the more perspectives we have, the more things we have to think about and consider when we're looking at human behavior. So we'll kind of start off with theme number one here, just a review of the sociological imagination and self-determination. So sociological imagination, right, of C. Wright Mills, of looking at the intersection between a person's biography, their own personal journey and story, and the larger social world that they live in. So, my choices that I've had available to my life, my life experiences, the decisions that I've made, in part, they're my decisions I've made, but also they're taking place within a larger cultural, social context. And the sociological imagination is encouraging us to be able to understand that larger social context around human behavior. So part of C. Wright Mills was the private trouble versus the public issue. And what the focus is trying to understand, like things like mass murders and mass shootings, like these are public private troubles, public issues. These are public issues. That's for sure. There are individuals who committed these crimes, but there's a pattern going on. There's something which speaks to there's something going on in society within culture and environment and institutions that's created an environment where mass shootings are more likely to happen. So it's encouraging us to think about that public issue, that social structure kind of component. And then self-determination is as a view of human behavior, which views human behavior as kind of like interacting between two different things. One is the free will, the choices that we make, human agency. We all have the ability to make choices. So there's the agency or the free will, but then there's also the impact of our status position, our race, our class, our gender, the historical time period we're living in, the institutions that are available to us, the context. And so there's a limit of the environment puts a constraint on our choices. Not everybody has the same choices available to them. Not everybody is involved in an environment that's either supporting or condemning certain choices. So we think about human behavior as being self-determined. Part of it's the individual, the human agency, but people are making choices within a larger context, environment, and things like that. So we can apply that to like think about individuals who experience homelessness, person experiencing addiction, not addition, individuals who commit homicide. We're looking at people need to be accountable for the decisions they make, but we're trying to understand those decisions in a larger social, cultural environment context. Okay, so let's walk through the theories, the positives theories of explaining why people do what they do. So the first real theory in criminology that's empirical, that's verifiable using the tools of science, is these biological ideas of criminality. And a person who's kind of famous for advancing these ideas was an Italian physician, Cesare Lombroso, who made a connection between biology and crime. He thought or believed that there were biological, hereditary, genetic links between or genetic foundations to criminal behavior. And he believed that he was objectively measuring and understanding. He's trying to find what is the variable that's influencing criminality, and he thought that this was a result of genetic and hereditary factors. Part of these ideas of these kind of theories is looking for the patterns of behavior, not just the individual, but rather patterns of behavior. The biological perspective is very much a Darwinian perspective, an evolutionary perspective. Lombroso believed that individuals who are more prone to crime were atavistic, atavistic. So an atavist is someone who's not evolved with the rest of the human species, this is the belief, that does not have the strength of cognitive capacity and rational and critical thinking, and more swayed by emotions and impulse. This is the belief that Lombroso was putting forward. So it's very much that gets us into, it's going to get us into racism and classism pretty fast. Lombroso made this connection between biology and crime. We look at it today, it's like, well, yeah, the claims he was making non-verifiable. I mean, while he believed they're empirical, while he believed they're based on like observable, measurable, and that it was good science, we realize today that there's a lot of things that are shaping his theory and his ideas, that there's biological explanations are very weak and unfounded, and sometimes get us into racism, sexism, classism, and other inequities. Lombroso, I think, was trying to understand. I mean, he was the one to give him credit. I think he was trying to understand systematically, like, how do we explain crime? And he's using science to be able to do that. Faulty as it might be, I think people give him credit for advancing an idea that we're trying to identify what are the factors going on that's influencing the likelihood of criminality. These are just pictures of him. He's like, or pictures not of Lombroso, but of individuals that he studied the human body, the face, eyes, nose, ears. Phrenology is a study of the human skull. Phrenology. Study of the human skull. I mean, people were fascinated this time period about studying the human skull to give us some indication about biological dispositions. This can get us into eugenics, which would get us in like different ideas about creating a stronger society through promoting individuals with good genes to reproduce and to limit the reproduction of those with bad genes. So gets into some pretty scary, touchy areas for sure. But I think one of the things, fair to go back to audience response and the temper of the audience from last week. One of the reasons why these biological ideas about crime were supported is there was a lot of social change going on, urbanization, industrialization, a lot of challenges. We didn't have institutions yet to develop to respond to a lot of social problems and issues. And this is a way for to try to understand what's going on with crime and what might be influencing it, and then give them direction to what to be able to do about it. Next theory of criminality is free will rational choice model. The assumption here is that humans are rational decision makers seeking to maximize pleasure and minimize pain or minimize loss. Rational choice theorists are not interested in examining why is something deviant, like the construction of things, or the subjectivity of people's decision making, like the interpretive nature of the meaning that people assign to certain things, like whether to smoke a cigarette or whether to use a particular substance, like the subjective, culturally defined different elements. Rational choice is just trying to identify the belief that people have free will and that humans have a condition, or there's an underlying propensity for humans to seek pleasure and minimize pain. Now, there's been a lot of critique of this model, and this is where we get to the limited rational choice, that historically, if it's just seen as free will and rational choice, that does not address the impact of environment, social forces, constraints, and all that kind of stuff. So now we talk about the limited rational choice, is that while people do have a degree of human agency and influence, there are also influences going on that are people's decisions are being shaped and influenced by the environment and the context in which they live. I'm not going to worry about the routine activities approaches today. It's just a way of just another example of the rational choice model. Let's just kind of go away from that. This is sort of the idea, just the rational choice kind of focus. Like, for example, rioting, Black Lives Matter. Some of those events led to rioting. Could look at the attack on the nation's capital, the insurrection of the nation's capital back in 2022 in January. These were individuals who were making decisions, and they were individuals who were deciding to act in particular ways. They were seeking some gain, some benefit, and they're trying to minimize kind of a loss in a way. This is where, maybe if there's a larger presence of law enforcement at the nation's capital, there have been different decision making because it could have been consequences for breaching the nation's capital. So this is the idea of the free will, rational choice, but always remember it's limited rational choice, that we have to be able to consider the influence of the environment and the context. One thing that's important to know from a criminology class or sociology of deviance is that there's this idea of the classical school of criminology, which is the foundation really for a rational choice model. So a couple different theorists, Enlightenment thinkers, 1700s, Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham, they were what we call utilitarian philosophers. They believed in this idea of free will and rational choice. And they provided a model of how to address crime and for the state to be involved in addressing crime and trying to limit criminal activity. And it's based on certain principles where you're trying to increase the cost, which is like this: if humans are calculating between benefit and loss, you're trying to increase the loss or the impact or the consequences. And here's the model that Beccaria and Bentham proposed, that's called the classical school of criminology. The idea is that a punishment works, and it works best when people are certain of getting caught. If people get caught 1 out of 50,000 times, then the certainty level is really low. The law is not going to have as much of an influence. This is the logic. There's some problems in this logic, but this is the logic of this. That the penalties should be applied swiftly. So somebody should be punished as soon after they commit the offense. It should be a swift punishment. They should receive punishment in a swift fashion. The logic here is if you waited 15 years to get punishment, the law and the punishment don't have as much of an impact as if it happened right then at that particular moment, or at least close to that. That the punishment needs to be severe enough to encourage people to make different decisions. So it could be like, okay, longer time in terms of prison could be a way of increasing severity to try to control the degree of crime within a community, and that the punishment should be proportional to the actual crime. So that a person who is caught speeding 25 miles an hour over the speed limit should receive a life sentence, and that's disproportional. It should be proportional to the crime, in part because if it was disproportional, the state's exercising too much power. People may be concerned that the state has too much power and start to critique the state. So this theory, the reason I want to introduce it, of this like a rational choice kind of model, framework thinking, classical school criminology fits in this sort of idea that people are making decisions, calculating benefit cost analysis. And then this theory, this idea had a resurgence in the 1980s with the war on drugs, where things like determinant sentencing and sentencing guidelines, that mandatory minimums, like these kind of things, 3 strikes, you're out, that the belief was we're just going to increase incarceration, increase the cost. That's going to deter people's possession and use of illicit substances. And clearly, this did not work. It's not about. I mean, you could, if somebody has an addiction, making that punishment larger, more swift, more certain is not going to be the solution to the problem. This is a public health issue, and there's more going on than this sort of idea about increasing the ratio of cost relative to the benefit. All right, next theory, Merton's strain theory. This is an extension of functionalism. And the reason why it's an extension of functionalism is that Merton's looking at the cultural goals or the cultural values of society, this consensus of values. And he's also looking at, are the institutions in society doing what they should be doing? So this is a more macro level, not an individual level theory. It's not looking at a more psychological or social psych examination of criminality, but rather looking at a community level, at a society level, what are the conditions that may be influencing certain types of deviant or criminal activity. His examination, there's been critiques of this model as with all the models, but his viewpoint was that in the United States, there's a dominant cultural goal that our status is attached to our achievement of the American dream. So that we put a lot of value and we put a lot of, give people a lot of authority and status and positive regard if they have acquired more material possessions, wealth, house, all these different kind of elements, that it's an indication of status and position. And it's also, we give as a society and a culture reward individuals for the achievement. And it's a real strong one, right? Where people's mental health can be impacted or their states of mind impacted if they're not achieving the American dream. They feel like a failure, especially in a culture that values a strong individualism and says anybody can make it. And if you don't get to that place of achieving the American dream, it's your own fault. I mean, it's really hard on people and community and society. So that cultural goal is that's what we as a society put a lot of focus on for status achievement, is that American dream. Well, the limit of this model is that it assumes that everybody has that vision of the American dream. I don't want to go too far down that pathway, but there is a limit to this model or a critique of this model. So we have the cultural goals, and then we have the institutional means. So it's one thing, we have the goal of getting the American dream, getting a large house, car, certain types of vacation, like all these different kind of things. If you have the means to get there, you live in a community that provides quality education, a family structure and environment that's supportive, that has the financial resources, and you have the means to get there, there's little strain going on within that community. And certain types of crime and deviance are much less likely to happen. It's in communities where there's a greater gap between that goal and the means, where schools are underfunded and understaffed. There's not a lot of economic opportunity. There's a lot of limitations that economic environment, and that's an environment where there's a big strain between the cultural goal and the institutional means. And what Merton kind of provided with this was this kind of analysis that in most communities, people conform. They accept the goal of the American dream, even though they may not be like fully like, oh, I want, a $15 million yacht. They just accept the American dream, the value of working hard and achievement, and the sort of idea of the American dream. And they conform to it. So they just going to work, doing the things that are the right things to do in order to try to get there. Most people, even in most challenging environments, are engaged in conformity. Every once in a while, some people engage in innovation, where they reject the means to get there, but they still accept the American dream. So how do you explain, for example, dealing, distributing illicit or illegal drugs and substances in an environment? I mean, I totally get it from an innovation standpoint that we as a culture put a lot of status and a lot of value on people who have material possessions. It's a way of achieving status and position within your own social group and within society. If you don't have the access to the resources to get there in legitimate ways, you reject those legitimate ways and innovate and come up with other ways of doing it. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, why work at a fast food restaurant, make little money versus you can be distributing drugs on the street and making a lot of money? It seems like innovation in that environment is just logical step to happen. Then Burton talks about ritualism. Sometimes people, where they reject the goal, like, I'm not going to try to get the American dream anymore. They just accept their position in life. So ritualistically going to jobs, go to work, day-to-day life, not trying to climb the ladder, so to speak, anymore, but just ritualistically, just kind of going through daily life. There's retreatism. So like drug using subcultures, the unhoused or homeless community, people retreating from society. So it's like, man, my opportunities are blocked. I don't have as many opportunities. Sometimes people retreat from society as a response to that. And then every once in a while, at a macro level, there's an advocating for different means. So providing more opportunities for education, more economic opportunities, or for redefining the American dream and saying, you know what, the American dream should be about other things besides just what you own and what you possess. It's your character and your moral values and your life experience. Like that's a redefining the American dream at a more macro level. So it's rebellion, not at an individual level, but what's going on in society that's working and addressing some of these strains that are going on within communities. So that's strain theory. So now we go to number 5. So differential association. So Sutherland was interested in studying white collar crime. That's where he focused his attention, which is things like fraud, embezzlement, corporate crime. This is where he developed his theory. And it makes sense to me. Well, I'll go walk through the theory, then I think it makes sense why you could apply this to white collar crime. The viewpoint of it, this is a social learning theory, social psychology, that it's focused on learning. It's a social learning model. People learn criminal behavior just like they learn conventional behavior or non-criminal behavior. You learn how to be an athlete, you learn how to be a musician, you learn how to do whatever you do based on very similar things than learning how to engage in criminal activity or deviant activity. So the process of learning is the same. What people learn is different, but the process is the same. When we learn, we have to be motivated. And we do that in a group environment. People are helping to encourage us to do or not to do something. We engage in ways of rationalizing our behavior, and that happens in a group environment. We also may develop attitudes that support criminal behavior or deviant behavior, and that's happening within a social environment. For example, the first time somebody smokes cigarettes, almost always it's with people of the same age group, peer groups. And so it's peer groups that are giving motivations. Think about binge drinking operates this way as well. People oftentimes in that social group, they're given motivations, rationalizations. The group is giving them justifications for their behavior and attitudes for supporting, engaging in a particular deviant or criminal activity. The abuse of prisoners by guards. I mean, this is like socially learned. I mean, this happens within a particular context and environment that the social group is through that group experience, learning how to think about things in particular ways that's influencing people's behavior. Learning influences people's views of whether violating the law or social norms is favorable versus or unfavorable. So Sutherland had this ideas that, let's say, like using heroin, that for most of my life, let's just say it's like very unfavorable. But then I get involved in a social group, and in that social group, that social group's providing, and people in that group are shaping my way of looking at heroin, and I start to reevaluate my ideas about heroin, and that's going to start to change. Maybe I start to rationalize, well, if I did use, I can rationalize it. And so now it becomes more, I've been in that group for a period of time, it becomes more favorable to commit that particular, to use heroin than before, where it was very unfavorable. Now, the degree of influence of the group is going to depend on a couple different variables. One is the priority that group has in a person's life. So is that group important to me or to that person? The more priority that group has in a person's life, the more status they gain from being a member of that group, the more value they see in terms of the connections to that group's going to have more of an influence on their behavior. And then the intensity of the involvement. If people are involved in a group on a regular basis and are intensely involved, that group's going to have a lot more of an influence. The insurgency nation's capital in January 6th of 2021, good example. It's like, okay, in this court of this environment, even before January 6th, people are in a particular, like whether it's social media or in a network of people, they're getting encouraged to engage in certain behavior. They're rationalizing their behavior. They're learning motivations, learning all these different kind of things that's happening within a social environment. And then the next theory is this idea, it's called social control theory or social bond theory, Hershey's social control theory, Hershey's bond theory. And it's pretty provocative. What Hershey offers asks the question, not why do people commit deviance, but why don't they? So why not? Why not steal money from an employer? It's like it's right there. And the odds of getting caught are pretty small. Why not? Like why don't people break the law more often or engage in deviance more often than they do? And what Hershey's doing in asking this question is he's addressing the issue of informal social control. That the more that people are positively connected to other people who are conventional, who are like, say, in the workforce, who hold steady jobs, who are emotionally stable, who are contributing members of society, like people are attached to conventional society or just attached to others. They want to conform to the wishes and desires and expectations of that group because that group's important or those individuals are important to them. So some people may not commit acts of deviance or crime because they don't want to disappoint other people. And you don't want to disappoint people. You have to be integrated with those people. You have to have a sense of belonging and connection. So the factors considered here include the attachment to conventional others, a belief in conventional society, opportunities to engage in conventional behavior. So there's been work and research on teenage pregnancy rates across the United States, red states, conservative states, Republican states versus blue states, Democratic leaning states. And teenage pregnancy rates tend to be higher in red states than in blue states. One of the factors that's been identified is economic opportunity, that in blue states, this isn't necessarily the result of Democratic leadership, but in blue states, there tends to be more economic growth and opportunity. And you start thinking about this, that if people have economic opportunity and significant economic opportunity, it's probably going to have an impact on, they have a stake in conformity that if person decides to engage in sexual relations without taking efforts for preventing a pregnancy, they're basically maybe be a big disappointment, maybe to individuals, their family and friends and community and network. And part of that's all possible because if there's a lot of opportunity in that space, there's an opportunity for conventional opportunity for education, opportunity for jobs and employment. There's a belief that if I do these things, I can get to that particular outcome. There's an attachment to people who also believe that this is going to develop people's stake in conformity. And the powerful view of this theory or idea of this theory is that just because I would say I don't use heroin, somebody does, doesn't mean I'm a more moral person than that person who does, or that I don't have an addiction, other people have an addiction, doesn't mean I'm a better person than somebody else. I have a greater stake in conformity. I have more to lose, becomes Hershey's argument or perspective. So you think about, I don't know, like there's been certain things policies put together, like urban gardens are a great way of crime control measures, crime prevention measures, because it gets people involved in the community, sense of belonging and connection. There's a program called Midnight Basketball in the 1980s, 1990s in inner city communities and neighborhoods to bring back basketball, a way of facilitating connection between people. The more people are connected to their neighborhood and community, they have a greater sense of stake and conformity and responsibility for people in that community. All right, so now number 7, and we're going to talk about this one probably the following week or the week after as well. It's called social disorganization theory. And this is the first major theory that in sociology that moves us away from an individualistic explanations to looking at the environment and context. So if I put these in chronological order, the biological theories came first, and then social disorganization theories in 1910s came second. And this was a radical departure from that biological view. The focus here is looking at what is going on at the level of the community and how the community is organized, and the degree of that community organization, degree of impact of that community, of how it's organized on degrees of crime. So this is an application of functionalism, whether or not, for example, institutions and structures in that community are working well, working to create a stable social order. And also addressing anomie when there's a lot of change going on in a community. People are moving in and out. People don't have a lot of strong bonds and connections to each other. It's in that kind of environment where there's been a rupture, a sudden dramatic change and shift, or anomie creates an environment where it's difficult to bring stability and order in that particular place. We can talk about this concept of structural social mobility. And, I guess in a general idea, looking at to give you an example, like 1970s, 1980s, manufacturing jobs in the United States started to significantly decline. A lot of industries like the steel industry and other industries started to significantly decline. A lot of jobs in certain neighborhoods, certain cities like Baltimore, Pittsburgh, other places lost a lot of jobs. Unemployment goes up, poverty goes up, crime goes up. So the structure of society, the economic structure shifted, and that impacted the mobility of people within society. So the focus is here on social disorganization theory of looking at what is the overall organization of the community and how is that impacted by larger economic forces. So the advancement of this theory is that it moves us away from individualistic notions of criminality and focuses on we're going to go to the environment and the context. And if we're looking at policies that would come out of social disorganization theory, recommendations would be is doing things to actually create community within a particular environment. So things like urban gardens would be a great way of doing it, or midnight basketball, development of community, development of connections, development of economic vitality within the community. There were laws, before the, starting in the 1980s, 1990s, stop and frisk, where law enforcement had a lot of authority to stop people who they believed might be might engage in or be engaging in criminal activity, to stop them and frisk them. Later became identified as unconstitutional practice because of racial profiling. But like policies like that were engaged in by law enforcement actually create another level of the problem within certain communities. It's just further, and like the war on drugs and mass incarceration created further disorganization within the communities. So sometimes the response from formal social control agents like law enforcement are actually creating more disorganization by their approach to the responses. There's limitations to this model too. This model doesn't address things like white collar crime or crime in suburbia. I think if you're interested, there's the great example. The whole book is about different communities and their experience of post-industrialism, and it's called When Work Disappears, written by an African-American Harvard sociologist from Harvard, William Julius Wilson. A more contemporary book, Tightrope 2020. In 2020, it's about Yamhill, Oregon, and it's kind of like what happened during the 1970s, 1980s, and the rubber plant that was there disappeared. The industries in terms related to timber industry, jobs started to go away. Like there became a disintegration within the community itself. All right, so let's go to the next theory. Conflict theory is going to look at economic inequalities, right? Economic or racial or gender or sexual orientation, sexual identity, gender identity. And it's going to examine power and inequities. And the reason for examining them is to help encourage awareness, understanding, and ultimately to help facilitate a more just and more equal world. So conflict theorists are about ultimately the value of greater democratic ideals and about ensuring that the ideals within a society are being upheld equally for everyone. So conflict theory is going to look at power and inequality, who's writing the law, whose interests are served by the law. This is a model of social justice. This is a study I kind of put in here of looking at, this is like one of like literally hundreds of studies that do the same thing of looking at, there's a link between crime rates and economic inequality, and that they're positively correlated. The greater the economic inequality, the greater the crime rates. So if I go back to hegemony and ideological social control, is that, okay, well, yes, okay, if there's greater degree of inequality, increase in crime, one strategy or one remedy of addressing crime rates is to decrease economic inequality, redistribution of wealth from the wealthy to distributing that income to more people through tax codes and other ways. Well, this is going to be opposed by a lot of people, including those who are not wealthy, because this idea of hegemony, people may be voting against their economic interest. People who are in a struggling class may not believe that the wealthy should be taxed higher at a higher rate. But it seems like to me from a conflict theory perspective that, if there's a positive correlation between inequality and crime, and we're not talking about inequality, this is purposeful, this is by design. We're not talking about inequality because that serves the interest of those with resources and power. You can look at other issues about where conflict theory might address, looking at, well, who are the judges, and does the gender composition of judges make a difference? Does the racial composition of judges make a difference? Inequalities within the criminal justice system are institutionalized. They exist throughout the whole system, just like with education and healthcare. So I'm not picking on criminal justice as like one institution. But all institutions, there's inequities that are built into the structure and institution. It's a reflection of those inequities in society itself. Conflict theory is going to provide a space of looking at patriarchy and addressing things from a more of a feminist theory viewpoint or queer theory viewpoint of examining sexual orientation and sexual identity and gender identity and inequities in terms of laws and practices of what's defined as deviant or criminal, and then critical race theory as well. This book, The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison, is a good example of a conflict theory idea. And then social constructionism, focused on the rules, the definitions of what's deviant and criminal. We talked about this before, so we'll go through it pretty fast here, but the focus is on understanding the cultural values and beliefs and how they shape definitions of what's deviant or criminal. What is deviant or criminal is doesn't necessarily have to be related to objective level of harm. Smoking tobacco was harmful for a long period of time until the 70s before it became recognized and people started to see the negative effects of smoking. Social constructionism moves us away from individual, like the positivist viewpoints, and get us to investigate social cultural influences on the process of meaning and the way that meanings are assigned towards deviance and crime. So focus on the rule making, the process of making rules versus individual choices and decisions. And you can maybe integrate the micro level and the macro level, where individual ideas, that's the micro level, and then those ideas come from larger macro level social cultural kind of components. Social constructionism, the audience gets us into audience reaction. So part of like, if we construct an idea that marijuana causes people to commit murder, that's what's constructed. That influences how the audience responds to something. It's required that for deviance to happen, that there's an identification that something is wrong or bad, something is labeled that way. So constructionism is interested in that process of labeling and stigmatization. This idea that from like Howard Becker, a researcher, becoming a marijuana user, like how do things become identified as being deviant or criminal? And then we'll get to labeling theory later. I think it's at the next point. Yeah, labeling theory. So let's kind of bypass these 2 bullet points for now. And then labeling theory, and then medicalization, which is an extension of that. So labeling theory addresses basically thinking about, we have a stimulus or an object, then we have the interpretation, and then we have the response. So marijuana is a plant. It's just an object. Then there's the interpretation of it, and our responses are based on the interpretation. So if we're to go way back to the first week of the term, we talked about the 4 elements of deviance: the act, the actor, the audience, and the context, historical, social, cultural context. Is that labeling theory, what we're going to address things like the act, what's being defined as being deviant or criminal, is a reflection of what's going on historically, culturally, with the values within society itself. Nothing is universally deviant, like all these different kind of things. So it's understanding the process of something becoming labeled as a deviant or criminal or unlabeled, and also looking at how labels impact people's lives, that issue of stigma. Lemert was interested in examining the impact of labels on people's identity and their future behavior. So what he identified, we had primary deviance, is deviance that happens before being labeled as being deviant. So let's say I engage in marijuana smoking for a long time. No one, my colleagues don't know, other people don't know. I've never been caught. My family circles for smoking marijuana, all primary deviance. Or maybe let's use opioids as a different example, just because marijuana is legal today in the state of Oregon. That's all primary deviance. It's gone on for a long time. No one knows about it. My employer doesn't know about it. Then I move into like something happens. I get identified. The person gets identified as being engaging in deviant or criminal activity. They get labeled as a person with an addiction, or even more highly stigmatizing language, as an addict, a junkie, like get labeled and responded to from the audience, from community. And sometimes that response does the label and the response is actually escalates future deviant criminal behavior, because that response of people being ridiculed and shamed and stigmatized, losing economic opportunities, losing jobs, losing employment, losing whatever all those different consequences may be, it's the reaction that may generate more criminal or deviant behavior. So primary is before the label. Secondary is looking at the behavior, what happens after people become labeled as being deviant, what happens as a result of the labeling process and the stigma. And then there's this other area of tertiary deviance, where people eventually may accept their deviant identity or the deviant stigma or label. So I'll give you a couple of powerful examples. In the 1980s, a lot of politicians, Democrats and Republicans, talked about inner city youth, predominantly youth of color, as super predators, and that they're prone to violence, prone to criminality. There's nothing we could do, and we need to be super afraid of them. They're incredibly violent. We need to protect ourselves from them. And I mean, we look back historically and go, man, whoa, like using this label of super predator for kids who are like 10, 11, 12 years old. It's a powerful label that's constructing the way people interpret. And if people in community and society see that youth in the inner city and youth of color in a certain way, that starts to escalate certain kind of responses. In the language of incarceration, there's a language shift going on from talking about convicts to inmates to adults in custody. So it's addressing, like, people are serving their time. Let's be sensitive and aware and recognize that sometimes these labels can have a powerful impact. So let's focus on talking about adults in custody becomes the focus. From vagrants to homeless to those experiencing houselessness. And it's more than just being like kind and, like language. It's like, no, it's just thinking about that, understanding that language and stigma and labeling can be a master status in people's lives, and that label actually can be counterproductive to encouraging people to develop more pro-social behavior in the future. Sometimes labels, people can embrace them, like the queer was originally intended as a derogatory statement in the 1960s, 70s to the gay rights movement, the queer movement, and eventually the queer movement, gay rights movement embraced that term, and so took that as a symbol, as a sign of empowerment and strength. So redefining that label, taking the power away from that stigma. And then finally, an application of labeling theories in the medicalization. And this is where this theory of deviance, Peter Conrad, probably most well known for it, is that the view that more and more of our life is becoming defined through medical terminology, when that could include mental health, psychological, psychiatric terminology, that we've moved into an era of more illnesses and disorders, so that the labels and the ways of thinking, that the meaning that's being constructed is along medical, psychiatric, psychological lines. So I'll give you an example, the case of hysteria. Go back to the 1880s. A French neurologist identified that women were more prone to this particular physical illness, and that it was a pathology, and that part of their mood, the mood instability of certain women in certain conditions, was related to this idea of their reproductive organs. Freud identified hysteria as a psychological scar produced through trauma or repression. And he had this sort of ancient myth of the Oedipal complex, which won't talk about, but so Freud is like medicalizing, saying, okay, women who have a certain emotional state, it must be due to some trauma or repression that's impacted, that's springing from their reproductive organs, and their emotional state as a result of that. Hysteria comes into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, the manual that clinicians use, mental health providers use to make diagnoses. It was brought in there in 1968, the condition of hysteria, and then it was removed in 1980 because of questions about the validity of this particular diagnosis, about the gender inequity that this diagnosis is kind of promoting. And I don't know if you want, there's a really fascinating short write-up in this. I provided a little summary here. The history of hysteria, it's super fascinating. Like this, constructing this idea of medicalizing women's bodies and providing some sort of rationale for why certain conditions that women have, and it's related to reproductive organs. This is all about social construction, labeling, and we're medicalizing. Another example is that, alcoholism as a disease did not emerge as language or an idea until the 1940s, 1950s. And then we moved away from it as a disease to alcohol dependence. So it went from a medical to a psychiatric or a mental health alcohol dependence. So it's the medicalization of things. And then there was I think it's just important to know, I think, you should, if you're interested, to research it, look into it, is the anti-psychiatry movement in the 1960s, 1970s. Mostly the 1960s, I think. A response, there's mass institutionalization of the mentally ill in the 1950s, 1960s, 1940s. Electroconvulsive shock therapy, full-on lobotomies, the frontal lobe was being removed from people experiencing psychosis. So the brutal treatment of individuals. And Thomas Szasz and others became part of this anti-psychiatry movement, where they started to challenge this idea that the field of psychiatry and psychology were defining more and more social maladies as mental health conditions and problems, and they were questioning the validity of a lot of the claims that were coming out of the field of psychiatry. Thomas Szasz did not disagree that things like depression were real or anxiety is real, but he believed that if something like depression is being influenced by our social environment, which it is, like the way in which society is organized, and we're calling it an individual disorder where the problem is in society, this is part of the problem that Szasz has with that. So he's critiquing the medicalization of ideas of deviance. Okay, that was a lot of different theories, but really important to go through all those different theories. Each one of those, there's probably YouTube videos out there on them. So if you're like, man, I just want more information, you can find it there. Like I said before at the start of this, Stuart Henry tells the story of all these different theories. He's bringing them in different chapters. It's hard to kind of keep track of. Hopefully this video kind of like really put these theories, the main ideas, kind of in perspective for you. If you do have questions, let me know. Have a beautiful day, and until next time.